Are we ready? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. My name is Fareed Khan, founder of the group Canadians United Against Hate, and I'm here today with NDP Foreign Affairs critic Heather McPherson, who's joining us remotely, and representatives of human rights groups to mark International Human Rights Day, which is on December 10th. I speak today to call attention to Canada's lackluster efforts to address human rights, atrocities abroad, and its lack of interest in challenging provincial governments that violate the charter rights of Canadians and their civil liberties. This year's Human Rights Day occurs against a backdrop of ongoing charter rights violations in Quebec, with its racist Bill 21 secularism law and its Bill 96 French language law, both of which target minority communities. In Ontario, Doug Ford's Conservatives are the first government in that province to use the notwithstanding clause to violate fundamental rights, not once but 3 times since they were first elected in 2018. And recent political developments in Alberta with its sovereignty bill will not only violate the Constitution according to legal experts, but could also be used to violate charter rights. Internationally, we have a worsening situation on human rights, with China committing genocide against the Uyghurs, and yet the Canadian government has done little to penalize them for this horrific crime. In Myanmar, the Rohingya remaining there face an ongoing genocide, but beyond providing humanitarian aid, Canada has done little more than repeatedly issue PR statements about how it will help the Rohingya genocide case at the International Court of Justice, and then failing to follow through. In India, members of Narendra Modi's fascist government have called for the genocide of the 200 million Muslims in that country, and yet Canada is pursuing a free trade deal with this fascist regime. And in Israel, the new government is comprised of several cabinet members who have advocated violent apartheid policies targeting Palestinians, and yet Canada does nothing to address the litany of human rights crimes committed by its government. Compare these situations to Canada's efforts in supporting the rights of Ukrainians against Russia, and you have to wonder whether being white and Christian is the yardstick Canada uses by which it decides whether to commit itself wholly to defending human rights overseas. Canadians should be concerned about human rights at home also. Speak to any black male or Indigenous person, they will tell you stories about how they or someone they know was a victim of profiling or police brutality. The incidents of black and Indigenous people killed in police shootings and Canada's history of Indigenous genocide is a testament that their rights under the Constitution are consistently violated. Quebec violates the religious rights of Muslims, Jews, and Sikhs under Bill 21 in a province which has made a habit of violating the rights and liberties of Anglophones since 1982. Across Canada, the charter rights of citizens have been violated 26 times by provincial and territorial governments over 40 years, not because there was some urgent civil emergency that required it, but because governments were willing to sacrifice basic rights on the altar of political agendas. The worst offender has been Quebec, which has used the notwithstanding clause to override rights 17 times. In none of these instances did the Canadian government use its authority under the Constitution to override those provincial laws and protect the fundamental rights of Canadians, which is unacceptable. If there is one word that can define Canada's approach to defending human rights over the past few decades, both at home and abroad, regardless of which party was in power, it's phony. So we are calling on the Canadian government to live up to its constitutional obligations to protect the charter rights of Canadians against provincial excesses and fulfill its international legal obligations. No one should have their fundamental rights violated in Canada or be subjected to the brutality of racist and fascist regimes internationally. Canada must do better, because the price of not doing so is to willfully ignore the principles of fundamental justice and the human rights of the oppressed. Saleha? Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, it's Heather next. Sorry.
Correct.
My apologies.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, it is my pleasure to be here with several Canadian-based human rights organizations to mark International Human Rights Day and to talk about the responsibilities the federal government has to promote and to protect human rights worldwide. New Democrats stand in solidarity with activists and advocates around the world in reaffirming our commitment to fight for equality and dignity for all peoples. Today, we remember that in many parts of the world, including in Canada, people are still persecuted for their gender, their race, religion, beliefs, age, sexual orientation, language, or simply for seeking the truth. Canada must remain resolute in denouncing all violations to our inalienable human rights, as they're the foundation of a free and democratic society. Today's speakers will highlight the plight of minorities and vulnerable groups in several parts of the world, and I just want to mention briefly some of the work that the New Democratic Party has done on these issues. You know, obviously, New Democrats deplore the human rights violations that are happening in China against the persecuted peoples, but particularly against the Uyghur people. We've pushed the Canadian Parliament to recognize the treatment of Uyghurs as genocide, and we urge the government to use all tools at its disposal to protect Uyghurs and other persecuted peoples in China. This includes those who've been wrongly incarcerated, like Hussein Jalil, who's been incarcerated for over 16 years, and Dong Guangping, whose family in Canada are desperate for news of his whereabouts. Last week, I spoke about the deplorable and deteriorating human rights condition and growing number of anti-Muslim and Islamic hate crimes and abuse towards minorities in India. You know, as Canada strives to develop a closer trading relationship with India, our government must raise the issue of human rights abuses with the Modi government, and we must refuse to be complicit in human rights abuses. New Democrats have always stood for the human rights of the Rohingya, who have been so persecuted and continue to need Canada's support. My predecessors like Linda Duncan, Ellen Laverdiere, and Paul Dewar fought for the rights of the Rohingya, and my colleagues and I in the NDP caucus will continue that work. And New Democrats believe that Canada has an important role to play in finding a lasting, peaceful, and just resolution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and that Canada must play a stronger role in ensuring that all human rights and international laws are respected. Canada must stand with international law and use the same lens of protecting human rights in Palestine as we would in other areas of the world. New Democrats believe that human rights are human rights are human rights, and Canada cannot pick and choose whose human rights matter. Canada has the power to be an honest broker, a middle power, and a convener. We must use that influence to make the world a safer, better place for all people. I'll pass the mic back to these speakers who are doing the important and very crucial work to shed light on these important issues, and we can address these human rights crises in more detail. Thank you very much.
I wanted to thank respected MP Heather for her strong words and commitment to human rights, and I also wanted to share my honor to express my honor, rather, to share the stage with human rights activists today. I think for the sake of brevity and to avoid redundancy, I'm just going to focus on Indian minorities that are victim to a series of discriminatory laws and policies in the region. So my name is Saleha Faruque, and I am a Government Relations Manager with Justice for All Canada. That is a genocide prevention organization as well as human rights and advocacy. Canada's newly released and newly announced Indo-Pacific strategy does acknowledge India as the world's largest democracy, but we argue that a democracy cannot coexist with a government ruled by the Bharatiya Janata Party, or the BJP, which is a right-wing nationalist party founded by an organization inspired by 20th century European fascism, and that is a fact. And as a result of that, over the past 20 years, underneath BJP rule, India has displayed a strong appetite for fascist crimes against humanity that are actively impacting the most vulnerable minorities, particularly Muslims, Christians, Dalits, as well as tribal communities that are not always accounted for in the media. So much so that the NGO Genocide Watch has issued a genocide alert for Muslim minorities in India. And so we're here under that context as well. Under Prime Minister Modi's regime, attacks on religious minorities have spiked enormously under right-wing supporters of his government. They are the perpetrators. And right now we find that the major targets of attacks are Muslims, Christians, and Dalits. Muslims in India, in particular, have been on the receiving end of hate mongering from Hindu nationalists, as well as extremists, both in everyday society, but as well as in digital spaces as well. And we believe that such discriminatory actions are sponsored by groups or individuals close to the BJP government, as reports consistently show. The failure of Indian Muslims to remain silent over state-imposed impose impunity has resulted in the indiscriminate demolition of Muslim-owned homes, as well as businesses across India, after they are, for example, linked to protesting the BJP's treatment of Muslims. So these shocking demolitions, as we see in the news, are a new phenomenon in India, whereby the homes as well as the livelihoods of minorities are under threat. So today in India, BJP officials also openly deliver hate speeches as well as shocking anti-minority rhetoric, all while India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi offers tacit support simply by remaining silent over such overt displays of racist discrimination impacting most minorities in the region. This is not only consistent with the 10 stages of genocide, as we know, but it's also led to the widespread economic boycotts, for example, of minority businesses and shops, as well as pretty horrific mob lynchings of Dalits and Muslims by cow vigilante groups, and of course other acts of discrimination as well. So under orders of the BJP, today thousands, for example, of Indian security forces are also stationed in Kashmir. Kashmir, of course, being the indigenous and occupied region, as well as coincidentally the location of next year's G20 meetings. So Kashmir is also home to thousands of activists and journalists that are arbitrarily detained for spotlighting the BJP's oppression of their fellow Kashmiris. And until today, we know that the Canadian government has not commented on the fact that the G20 meetings is going to be held not only in a contested indigenous land, but also in a region where thousands of people are arbitrarily detained simply for protesting peacefully, as well as free journalism. In December 2019, the Modi administration introduced a series as well of discriminatory citizenship laws that I alluded to in the beginning of my address here. And these citizenship laws, one of them is called the Citizenship Amendment Act, the other one is called the National Register of Citizens. They both work more or less to disenfranchise as well as to strip millions of Muslims of their Indian-born citizenship. So the truth is, democracy, as we know it, cannot exist in India while institutions in India that are meant to hold the government accountable are actively being degraded, thereby resulting in the widespread persecution and demonization of these minorities that I speak of. I think that, as I conclude, these realities, I just wanted to also note that these realities have been documented not just by our genocide prevention organization, but by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, as well as the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedoms and other human rights think tanks. I just wanted to speak also on behalf of thousands of Indo-Canadians here in the country who do live with trauma and fear for their loved ones back home. And I also represent other Canadians that might not be Indian like me, but that might care about international development as well as global human rights. So together we do call on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to acknowledge the Indian government's discriminatory anti-minority laws, the rising threat of genocide against Muslims, as well as the persecution of Christians, Dalits, and other minorities such as tribal communities. And last but not least, we have ambitious trade agreements like the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement that with India that really only work to empower and embolden fascist Indian leaders that are seeking to advance these exclusionary, this certain exclusionary atmosphere that's unwelcoming of minorities. So instead of developing trade deals with the BJP, who are responsible for this mayhem that I describe, we really call for Canada to rather move towards sanctioning the Indian government, particularly officials in the Indian government responsible for, as well as complicit in human rights violations against Muslims and other minorities in India. Thank you again for your valuable and generous time.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Bon matin, mesdames, messieurs. Mon nom est moi, Kayum Masimov. Je représente Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project. December 9th is the International Day of Commemoration and Dignity of the Victims of the Crime of Genocide, and it has been designated by the Uyghur exiled community as Uyghur Genocide Recognition Day. On behalf of the Uyghur community, Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project is calling on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and nations that believe in upholding human rights to take immediate action to end the Chinese government human rights atrocities against the Uyghur people, which are internationally recognized to constitute crimes against humanity and genocide. The Uyghur Canadian exile community stands with others in solidarity today who voice and sharing the stage in the parliament at the press conference to deliver the message of resistance to tyranny and hope for the Uyghur people. All state parties to the Geneva Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, including Canada, failed to uphold the legally binding international obligations to prevent the Uyghur genocide, prosecute the perpetrators, and help the genocide victims. We cannot allow the principle of rule of law turn into the law of rules. When it comes to China's genocidal crimes, collective action is needed more than ever to stop the Chinese government from continuing to commit genocidal policies against the Uyghur people. That was a statement of our director, Mehmet Tohti. Exactly 1 year ago, the Uyghur Tribunal announced its verdict that the Chinese government has committed genocide and crimes against humanity against Uyghurs. In the months that followed, resolutions were passed by French, Irish, and European parliamentary bodies which followed the tribunal's conclusion. The Uyghur Tribunal remains the most important legal assessment of the Uyghur human rights crisis, as well as the most comprehensive body of evidence today. The Uyghur genocide also prompted an increasingly strong response from UN bodies and human rights experts. Following the awaited assessment by the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, 50 UN member states issued a joint statement condemning the atrocities. On November 24th, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination issued a strong determination calling on China to release all detainees, cease intimidation and reprisals, and fully review its so-called national security and counterterrorism framework in East Turkestan. Nevertheless, the failure to pass a resolution to discuss the OHCHR report at the UN Human Rights Council and China's continued disregard for fundamental human rights shows that more needs to be done to end the suffering of Uyghur people. Governments should urgently introduce slavery and forced labor legislation, impose targeted sanctions, and increase their support for diaspora communities and Uyghur refugees. On Uyghur Genocide Recognition Day, Uyghurs worldwide reflect on the important achievements that have led to international recognition of the genocide, while commemorating the millions of victims affected by Chinese cruel, brutal policies, both in East Turkestan and abroad. We call on China to acknowledge its responsibilities under the 1948 UN Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and take all necessary steps to end the ongoing Uyghur genocide. And last but not least, Europe is also calling upon the Government of Canada to adopt the recommendations of the House Subcommittee on Human Rights and appoint a special envoy to China to bring home Mr. Hussein Jalil, an Uyghur Canadian who was abducted by the agents of the Chinese government while overseas and sent to China to stand trial for advocating in support of Uyghur rights. He has been forgotten by Canada while he's been languishing in the Chinese prison for the last 16 years. Merci beaucoup.
Good morning. My name is Tom Woodley. I'm the president of Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. Our mission is to empower Canadians of all backgrounds to promote justice, development, and peace in the Middle East. I believe my colleague John is going to give an Indigenous recognition for Ottawa. CJPME, our offices are located in Montreal, which is a traditional and unceded territory of the Kenyan Kahaka people and has been a meeting place for generations. International Human Rights Day is a day to remind us of the importance of protecting and preserving human rights for all. In observance of this day, we must give special focus to those human rights violations which are long-standing, deeply entrenched, and well documented. As Canadians, it's also important to highlight those human rights abuses which Canada could impact, but repeatedly chooses to ignore. As such, I call special attention to the violation of Palestinian human rights as a result of Israel's military occupation and apartheid practices against Palestinians. This is especially important now when Palestinians are facing increasing levels of repression and violence from Israel. All of the major human rights organizations of the world, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Israel-based Beit Salem, have recently issued reports detailing how Israel is practicing apartheid against Palestinians. Apartheid. As highlighted in the Amnesty report earlier this year, the Palestinian people have been subject to systematic oppression by Israel since 1948 and throughout the subsequent decades. This oppression has included land expropriation, political arrest, discriminatory laws, unfair trial practices, restrictions on freedom of movement, and other civil liberties. The ongoing military occupation of Palestinian territories further compounds the crimes of apartheid by placing Palestinians at risk from indiscriminate violence and making them vulnerable to violations such as arbitrary detention, torture, and extrajudicial executions. This is unsustainable and unacceptable. As mentioned a moment ago, these violations have been going on for decades, but the Trudeau government chooses to do nothing, to remain silent. By making constant reference to the international rules-based order in regard to human rights violations in other parts of the world, the Trudeau government seems unconcerned about upholding the international rules-based order when it comes to Palestine and Israel. This is hypocrisy, plain and simple. My organization, our criticism of the Trudeau government aligns with numerous public opinion polls on the question of Israel-Palestine, which demonstrate clearly that Canadians want their government to support Palestinian human rights, including in international forums. CJPME, my organization, continues to urge the Canadian government to adopt a series of measures that would show meaningful support for Palestinians while playing a constructive role in the region. For example, Canada should engage with the growing consensus among human rights organizations that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid as defined under international law. Canada should also stand up for human rights defenders, organizations, Palestinian organizations in the occupied territories, which Israel has criminalized. So Canada must stand up for them and oppose Israel's criminalization of them. Canada must suspend all military trade with Israel. Canada must provide support for investigations by the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice into war crimes and other alleged violations. Canada should support the reestablishment of the United Nations Special Committee Against Apartheid. And finally, Canada should push for an end to the blockade of Gaza, which has gone on, for 17 years now, and increase its funding for Palestinian refugees via UNRWA. International Human Rights Day should be a time for all of us to reflect on our collective responsibility to protect human rights everywhere. Canada and the rest of the world must stand in solidarity for the human rights of the Palestinian people. We must demand an end to Israel's endless military occupation of Palestinian territories and call for an end to its apartheid practices. May all Canadians stand in solidarity with the Palestinians and assert that their human rights too, are worthy of respect. Only then can we truly celebrate International Human Rights Day with a commitment to justice for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fareed. Thank you, Ms. McPherson, in particular for your persistent and consistent advocacy for human rights. I'd like to acknowledge that we meet today on the unceded and unsurrendered Indigenous homeland of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. My name is John Packer. I'm Director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. As we commemorate tomorrow and the next day the 74th anniversaries of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide and of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted respectively on 9 and 10 December 1948, Canadians must be struck by the widening gap between, on the one hand, the powerful words and promises of these foundational instruments of the international rules-based order, and, on the other hand, the failure fully to respect or implement them. In short, the distance between the talk and the walk of human rights is great and increasing. Regrettably, this is not just an observation of our world today. Unfortunately, it is also a statement about the positions and shortcomings of our own country, notably the Government of Canada, which carries the principal responsibility and enjoys the capacities to act in substantial and meaningful ways. Mainly, Canada is falling short of our obligations, especially in light of our possibilities and our capacities, what we should and could be doing. In this, I believe the Government of Canada is out of step with the people of Canada, who repeatedly call for human rights, humanitarian principles, and freedom to be upheld as our clear obligations and our essential values. In these tumultuous times, straight talk is required. So I commend the Government of Canada for recently having cottoned on that authoritarianism has gained strength and continues to rise around the world, and that there is no merit in previous generous interpretations or wishful thinking about the plainly dangerous conduct of many in the world. Clear eyes and heads are now in order. So are clear and sober decisions. As one of barely a handful of still fully democratic countries, according to Freedom House, Canada is by deduction in a position of responsibility that demands we meet the challenges, to stand up for human rights, to defend freedom, to protect democratic institutions and support those on the front lines around the world. We must do so clearly, consistently, and convincingly. This requires practical, purposeful, and determined action. Starting at home, we must lead by example, as many in the world look towards Canada and our comparatively good governance. We should start by incorporating into Canadian law all of our international human rights obligations and commitments. But dubious and cynical political games with our Constitution, crude invocations of the substantively suspect notwithstanding clause, and foot-dragging or worse in resolving well-known issues with Indigenous peoples in Canada are just some examples of shameful conduct that cause harm at home, contribute to the fraying of Canadian political culture, and undermine our credibility abroad. We must do better. Abroad, strong support for the defense of Ukraine is imperative, but glaring inconsistencies towards other situations raise many questions. Why so unhesitatingly does Prime Minister Trudeau recognize genocide against Indigenous peoples in Canada, including missing or murdered Indigenous women and girls, yet refuses to draw any conclusion, indeed formally to abstain in the face of enormous hard evidence, millions of victims, and undoubted serious risk of genocide against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, China? And how, after years of promoting a putative feminist foreign policy, is there still, in fact, no such policy, no document to show others or just to tell us what it is? Never mind substantial funding to advance it. What about the manifest threats of transnational repression, which increasingly have been reported in the media? Attacks against the personal integrity and freedoms of activists in exile, often Canadian citizens, not to mention the breach of Canada's basic territorial sovereignty. And where is a major program of support for democratization abroad? Perhaps a 21st century Marshall Plan for countries at least trying to transition from dictatorship to democracy and needing moral and material support, which Canada is in a position to provide. In these days, at this challenging time, Canada needs, and the world needs, a fulsome vision and a program of support unequivocally committed to human rights, good and democratic governance, and the rule of law. Canada could lead. Canada should lead. We are in a position, we have the resources. Our government need only decide to do it. I call upon Canada to walk the talk and affirm loudly and practically that Canada really acts for human rights at home and abroad for everyone. Thank you.
And we're ready for questions, right? We'll start with the room. If you're online, you want to ask a question, please use the raise hand function. Si vous êtes en ligne, vous voulez poser des questions, utilisez la fonction lever la main.
Hi, Dylan Robertson with the Canadian Press here. Open question for anyone who wants to talk about the Asia-Pacific region. In the new Indo-Pacific strategy, the government talks about forming connections with these countries. Aside, they mentioned India. You all spoke at length about India. I'm wondering about some of the other countries. I think Indonesia might be an interesting case with the legislation that's just passed about cracking down on protests, about criminalizing premarital sex. Now that the Indo-Pac strategy is out, this seems to be a test of the government. How should they respond when they're talking about forming closer ties when you have countries that aren't India or China that are doing that kind of thing?
John, would you?
Sure. Thank you for the question, and I think it's particularly timely in light of the news of the parliamentary decisions in Indonesia, which we've seen in the press. But let's widen that to say that in the recent speech by Ms. Freeland in Washington, she spoke about the distinction between, or seeing the world in a kind of dichotomy, or a kind of trichotomy, if we can call it that, between authoritarians and Democrats on wide ends, and then this huge in-between group of persons. If we look at Pacific region, I mean, this is preponderantly authoritarians. I mean, we can talk about for example, Sri Lanka. We can talk about, never mind Myanmar, where we have a junta in power and so forth. We can really, the whole situation here is very disconcerting, and for which, by the way, we have large Canadian diasporas here in Canada. We don't talk about what's going on with the 1/3 of a million Canadians in Hong Kong, for example, Canadian citizens. So I think that it's very nice to have this kind of pivot and this reconceptualization. The hard questions are, what do you actually stand up for, and where are you going to put the money that backs those positions? And we're calling for human rights and the rule of law to be front and center of that, and to be so in a consistent and persistent fashion. And that means, not just to make deals, as has been mentioned now with, for example, India. Yes, India is a major state in the world, a rising state in some regards, but its character is deeply disconcerting. And I think from a human rights perspective, there's no doubt that we at least should be clear in our positions and not make deals with the devil.
If I could just jump in as well, one of the things I think that the Canadian government could do right now is put in that legislation that would ensure that supply chains are free of forced labor, supply chains are free of human rights abuses. The government has been promising this legislation for a long time, and yet we haven't seen anything. There is some sort of patchwork quilts of private members' bills that are coming forward, but none of them will fundamentally address that issue of how we ensure that our supply chains, how we ensure that the companies working in these countries are not complicit and are not contributing to human rights abuses in these countries as well. That's another piece that Canada can be doing right now.
I'd also like to comment. Canada, both previous governments and certainly this government, has strided around the world talking about how this nation is a defender of the international legal order. It's a defender of human rights. Canada was one of the architects and Canadian diplomat co-wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and Canada was involved in the drafting of the Genocide Convention. These are two foundational documents of the United Nations, and Canada was integral to these documents becoming part of international law, and Canada acceded to these documents. And yet, despite walking around the world and saying that we defend human rights and the international rule of law, it seems that the way that it's done is selective. Canada does it only with political expediency or for economic gain, and it doesn't matter who the Canadian government decides to sign trade deals with. And this can't happen. If you are going to say that you stand for human rights, as Ms. McPherson said, human rights are human rights are human rights, and you can't be a hypocrite when it comes to dealing with governments who are human rights abusers. So this particular strategy, fine, Canada's a trading nation. Let's look for trading opportunities, but we can't be silent. We tried that with China back in the 90s when the first Team Canada trips happened under Jean Chrétien, and look where we are today. So we can't let that happen again with other nations in that region.
My follow-up, just on Indonesia specifically, I don't know if anyone had a specific action. What I'm hearing is just generally calling it out. But my other question is more about the military cooperation in the Indo-Pacific strategy. There's countries named there that there's some concerns about. I could get into specifics with you, but we're talking, Cambodia, Vietnam, Philippines. Again, I can give examples about why we might have concerns about human rights in the militaries of those countries. I guess I'm just wondering from Ms. McPherson and anyone who'd like to speak to those states, what should we do if we're talking about military cooperation? What should we put around that, or should we just not even go there?
Well, thanks very much for the question. One of the things that I think that we've seen with this government and the previous conservative government as well is that when the Canadian International Development Agency was swallowed up by DFAD and now Global Affairs Canada, we've seen this constant sort of move towards prioritizing trade over human rights, over development, over diplomatic relationships, over other areas of that foreign policy. As somebody mentioned earlier, we hear things like a feminist foreign policy. We don't have one of those in place. We haven't heard from the government what that looks like yet. So what I'm seeing is this over-dependence on trade, over-reliance on trade as a way to build relationships with regions. I think, in fact, what we need to be doing is reinvesting in things like peacekeeping, reinvesting in things like diplomacy and development. Now, I think the Indo-Pacific strategy speaks about that to some degree, but I think there needs to be a very concerted priority on putting that diplomacy front and center in our foreign policy and using that feminist lens. Because if we do indeed have relationships with these countries, if we do indeed have a feminist foreign policy, we have to look at things like military involvement, at procurement of arms, the selling of arms, the sharing of weapons through that feminist lens. And that changes the decisions that we make as a country, that this government would make. Unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing. That's not what we're seeing from this government. There doesn't seem to be a strong understanding of our obligations under the arms treaty, under arms trade treaty. There doesn't seem to be a strong understanding of what a feminist lens would look like as we come up with how we want to work with countries in the region that do have questionable human rights records.
And I'm going to check.
Perhaps somebody else would like to join in as well.
Yeah, maybe say something. I hesitated speaking before. I appreciate your questions about the Indo-Pacific region and the decisions and the things going on right now. I apologize. I'm not an expert on the Indo-Pacific region, and I didn't really anticipate a lot of questions on this here today. But let me take the opportunity to point out that today the issue may be Canada's relationship with Indo-Pacific nations. But we've been seeing this, we've heard here that this has been going on for years. And today, maybe the issue is Indo-Pacific. On my focus of expertise, the Middle East, Canada has been for decades sort of not really walking the talk. And that's sort of what we're here to talk about today. That I think, I do care about all regions of the world. Fareed mentioned that. And I think that's what needs to be expressed here. And we are concerned about, a sort of hypocrisy in Canada's position, whether it be with Indonesia or other countries in the Indo-Pacific area. I think if someone from the government were here, they'd sort of give a mealy-mouthed response about how we need to balance different priorities and we need to, think about trade and, this and that. But the opinion polls that my organization's done, the professional opinion polls, the opinion polls my colleague John mentioned, Canadians want this. They want the Canadian government to uphold these things. And in many situations, I think the world is waiting for the West to take a stand. They're waiting for the United States, for Canada, for Europe to sort of say, no, this really matters to us. That it's not, trade doesn't trump everything, that if there's a trading opportunity, then we ignore human rights. The world is waiting for the West, for Canada, for other countries to really say, no, this really does matter to us. And we are going to stand, and we are going to make tough decisions. And we're going to say no once in a while, because human rights really do matter. So that's what the world is waiting for, and they're just not seeing it decade after decade after decade, especially in the tension, the conflict area that I focus on, which is Israel-Palestine. Human rights is not a feel-good thing. You don't go around saying, I defend human rights, and you feel good about yourself. There's a price to pay in defending human rights. And at times, yes, you will lose opportunity because you stood up for something that needs standing up for. So this is very important. This is not, we're not here just because we want to feel good and, hey, we're all here for the International Human Rights Day. We're here because we care. The people here have devoted their lives to these things, and that needs to be expressed, and that needs to be understood, and this government needs to take that seriously. Some of my colleagues here, myself, I know people in the Middle East whose lives have been deeply impacted by this stuff, and Canada could make a difference. And that's what we want to see. Thank you.
And I'm going to check online if the reporter has a question. Please use your raise hand function. There's no question online. Dylan, you have one more?
Lightning round. I just wanted to follow up on some of the comments made before. One is just about the trends we're seeing in Israel right now, the coalition government with some questionable characters. If there's any example of other countries and how they've responded that Canada should be following right now when we're seeing this sort of trend away from what our policy is on paper under the Paul Martin policy when it comes to Palestine, just if my question makes sense, if anyone would like to speak to that, is there a country we should be emulating when it comes to the Israel-Palestine situation?
I think that the countries that we should look to are in Europe. Ireland is an ideal example of a country that has stood up for justice for Palestinians, as have some of the Scandinavian countries. I think those are the models to follow. We can't continue to, with respect to the issue with Palestine-Israel, we can't continue to have business as usual. There are human rights atrocities being committed. People are being killed every week. There was another incident that happened, I believe yesterday, Tom, with I think it was 10 Palestinian youth who were killed by Israeli security forces. this is a country that claims to be a democracy, but in actual fact isn't. And now we have a government where you've got cabinet members who are, I would say, fascists. And, they don't see Palestinians as human beings, and they want to expel all Palestinians from the lands they control. So I think that Canada needs to do far better if it wants to claim the mantle of being a human rights offender internationally.
I let my colleagues speak on this specific issue. I think the facts, are glaring, but I just want to connect it with something else in terms of what's doable, the art of the possible, and so forth. I think we would be remiss if we don't mention what's happening in our own hemisphere in Haiti right now. Haiti, a country where Canada's been involved for many years. We've spent billions of dollars. There have been many Canadians, RCMP, others, development cooperation, and so forth. The country is imploding right now. We have a significant diaspora. We have remarkable connections. There's a lot that could be done. Half the country now is illiterate, living on $2 a day while inflation is skyrocketing, cholera is growing. These are real threats, not only to the population, the poorest population, just a 3-hour flight from us right now, but affecting the region with all sorts of security and other dimensions. Where is Canada in this? I know that there are questions about should we join a force maybe led, UN sanctioned, led by the Americans or whatever. But where's the basic policy and the engagement? This is a place where Canada could and should have significant influence. And if we follow through a human rights-based approach, there are all sorts of policy implications of that, but we are just not seeing it. And that's here, near to us, where we have direct influence.
And I would maybe just add to what Fareed said. Fareed mentioned Ireland. I think things with respect to Israel, Palestine, and the new Israeli government, I think things are still sort of coming together. I'm not sure it's an entirely clear picture who will exactly form the new government and what its new policies will be. But I don't think we have to go as far as Ireland to sort of say, well, there's a country that's, the United States actually just a week or two ago, there was talk among some of the people that might form the government about passing certain laws that related to sort of how the West Bank would be administered. And the U.S. government made a statement to the effect that, look, if you proceed with a law like this, we will take this as, because the law was sort of suggesting that they would sort of take greater control, will say, we'll interpret this as Israel's planning on annexing the Palestinian territories, and we will respond accordingly, and we do not agree with this. So, I think if we're looking for looking for another country to sort of say, something that, I don't think we necessarily need a model. I think Canada should not necessarily follow another country. I think there will be some countries that will come out. Fareed mentioned Western Europe. I think there's probably a good place to think about. But I think there are other things going on, and even countries like the United States have sort of said, look, we sense what's coming, and we do not agree with what seems to be suggested here.
Always do. My last question is just about countries. There was a mention from two of the speakers here about countries that want to have a more democratic path. And I'm not necessarily challenging you, but when we look at the polling, we're seeing rising support for Russia, for China. I get foreign policy is not always binary, but there are countries that are backsliding, and there doesn't seem to be a popular support for more democracies. I'm wondering if you could speak to which countries you're seeing that demand for Canada to do more when we're seeing trends towards the opposite in credible polling.
Most of the situations we're seeing and the slide away from democracy is either the result of certain manipulations or largely exasperation, that people are in positions of vulnerability, things are not working. That does not mean at a popular level, if you look at global surveys and so forth, that, for example, people are giving up on freedom or don't want aspirations. Quite the contrary. Actually, according to the Uppsala University conflict database, half of all violent conflicts in the world, and we now have 2 billion people in the world, according to UN Secretary General Guterres, living in conflict situations, half of those conflicts are self-determination claim-related conflicts. People are crying out for freedom, for liberty, for protection, opportunity. Now, a lot of those are, for example, questions of complex governance, minority, majority, interethnic, multilinguistic, and so forth. Canada's got a pretty good record on this. Multiculturalism, plurilingualism, official bilingualism, and so forth. You know, it has been suggested previously. You mentioned Paul Martin, who actually suggested, I forget what he called it, Candacorp or something like that, to mobilize Canadian. We have good institutions, the Canadian Federation of Municipalities sharing local governance. Assistance, we started very late to give Ukraine on auditing, for example, to deal with anti-corruption. Corruption is a huge issue linked exactly to a lot of these conflicts. Canada can lead on these. We have real expertise. We have leaders in the world, Canadians. But where's the government? Where's the state policy on this? Where's the real? I don't mean writing checks. I mean real, deliberate, organized programs of support, and it has to be consistent. Otherwise, our credibility is shot, and that's a point that and increasingly around the world, people are raising questions about Canada because people know and see that our inconsistent conduct is glaring.
And this concludes the press conference. Ceci me fait la conférence de presse. Merci.